Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about Russia and the recent announcement that they've decided to revoke their ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Now, testing of nuclear weapons was a common thing in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. However, since the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was signed in the early 1990s, the big nuclear powers have stopped all testing. North Korea is now the only country in the world that has undertaken any nuclear testing in the last 30 years. However, Russia's announcement that they've decided to revoke this treaty now raises concerns that Russia will start testing again. And of course, this latest development is directly linked to what's happening in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has gone on for considerably longer than President Putin was originally planning. It was reported that he thought at the start of the war that this would be over in a matter of days, in a similar fashion to what happened in 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. However, more than 18 months on, this war is still raging and it doesn't look like there's any end in sight. And so far, Russia have pumped in billions of dollars into this war, and it is having a devastating impact on the Russian economy. And at some point over the course of the next 12 to 18 months, there is a very realistic possibility that Russia could run out of cash. And if that happens, that would be a complete disaster. And since the war started, we have seen the re-emergence of a potential Cold War. Russia has improved its relationships with a lot of countries in the Middle East and Asia, and a reignition of nuclear tension is the last thing that the globe needs right now. So in today's video, we'll go through the details of Russia's recent announcement and have a look at what's going through their parliamentary process at the moment. We'll then have a look at which countries in the world have nuclear weapons, there's currently 9 of them, and where those weapons are located. We'll then have a look at how much nuclear testing each country has undertaken and when their last test was actually done. We'll talk about the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty that Russia is now looking to revoke. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to why I think Russia is doing this, what the driving force behind this announcement is, and what the risks are to both the global economy and also the globe. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much for all the support that I've received recently. Really appreciate it. And if you'd like to see more face-to-face videos like this that I'm not posting on YouTube, hear about things that I'm working on in advance of me posting them on YouTube, and also be able to avoid all of the adverts on YouTube, then please check out my Patreon channel. However, if you don't like Patreon and you'd like to support the channel, please have a look below where you'll find links to buy me a coffee as well as YouTube super thanks and membership scheme. Russia's envoy to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization said recently that Moscow will revoke its ratification of the pact, a move that Washington denounced as endangering the global norm against nuclear test blasts. The announcement by Mikhail Ulyanov added new fuel to tensions between Russia and the United States over Moscow's invasion of Ukraine and arms control disputes between the world's largest nuclear weapons powers. Ulyanov announced on X that Russia plans to revoke ratification, which took place in the year 2000, of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. While the United States signed, they did not ratify the treaty, but it has observed a moratorium on nuclear weapon test explosions since 1992 and says it has no plans to abandon this policy. A US State Department spokesman said, "We are disturbed by the comments of Ambassador Ulyanov in Vienna today. A move like this by any state party needlessly endangers the global norm against nuclear explosive testing." This statement suggested that Washington sees Moscow's plans to revoke the CTBT ratification as a way to increase pressure on the United States and other countries to halt arms supplies and other aid to Ukraine in its fight against Russian troops. Some Western security analysts now see a growing likelihood of a Russian test, even though President Putin has said that the aim was only to mirror the position of the United States. A Russian nuclear test is clearly very much on the cards now. I don't think it's a certainty, but it shouldn't surprise anyone if it happens, said James Acton, co-director of the Nuclear Policy Programme at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Acton went on to say that it was plausible that Putin was preparing the option of a nuclear test as a warning signal if things went badly for him in Ukraine. He also said it was possible that President Putin had already decided he was going to test, irrespective of what was happening in the war. In that case, the test would be more of a statement about Russia's intention to further develop its nuclear weapons and about their growing importance in its defensive posture at a time when its conventional forces have struggled in Ukraine. Acton said that if Russia carried out a test, the United States was likely to follow, and that it could prompt China, India and Pakistan to do the same. CNN recently reported that Russia, the United States and China have all built new facilities and dug new tunnels at their nuclear test sites in recent years. The more countries test, the more are then likely to test, which is concerning, Acton said. If we're in a world in which testing is going on, the first thing that shows us is that nuclear risks have risen. Matthew Harris, Director of Proliferation and Nuclear Policy at the RUSI think tank in London, said if Moscow did conduct a test, it would be a strong form of signalling to put the nuclear threat in people's minds, to try to signal resolve and evoke fear. And former Soviet and Russian diplomat Nikolai Sokov went further, saying the Russian nuclear test would mark a very serious escalation towards actually using an atomic weapon. Putin last week highlighted two nuclear-capable weapons, the nuclear-propelled Burevestnik cruise missile and the Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile, which he said Russia would now mass-produce and place on combat duty. Since the start of the invasion, President Putin has served the West with repeated, pointed reminders of Russia's nuclear might, including by announcing the stationing of tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. He's also suspended Moscow's participation in the New START treaty that limits the number of nuclear warheads that Russia and the United States can deploy. President Putin's comments last week on the CTBT came in direct response to a question by a security analyst who suggested to Putin that Russia should lower its threshold for nuclear use in order to sober up the West. Putin said he saw no need to change the doctrine, which says Russia may use nuclear weapons in response to a nuclear attack or a threat to the existence of the state, but he was ambivalent on the question of nuclear testing. As a rule, experts say, with a new weapon, you need to make sure that the special warhead will work without failures, and you need to conduct tests, Putin said. He added that he was not ready to say whether tests were required. Nuclear weapons tests have historically been divided into four categories, reflecting the medium or location of the test. Atmospheric testing designates explosions that take place in the atmosphere. Generally, these have occurred as devices detonated on towers, balloons, barges or islands, or dropped from airplanes, and the United States, the Soviet Union and China have all conducted tests involving explosions of missile-launched bombs. Underground testing refers to nuclear tests conducted under the surface of the Earth at varying depths. This form of testing made up the majority of nuclear tests by the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Underground tests are intended to be fully contained and emit a negligible amount of fallout. However, unfortunately, these forms of nuclear tests do occasionally vent to the surface. Underground testing, almost by definition, causes seismic activity of a magnitude that depends on the yield of the nuclear device and the composition of the medium in which it is detonated, and generally creates a subsidence crater. Exo-atmospheric testing refers to nuclear tests conducted above the atmosphere, where the test devices are deployed on rockets. These high-altitude nuclear explosions can generate a nuclear electromagnetic pulse when they occur in the ionosphere, and charged particles resulting from the blast can cross hemispheres following geomagnetic lines of force to create an auroral display. Underwater testing involves nuclear devices being detonated underwater, usually moored to a ship or a barge. Tests of this nature have usually been conducted to evaluate the effects of nuclear weapons against naval vessels, or to evaluate potential sea-based nuclear weapons. Underwater tests close to the surface can disperse large amounts of radioactive particles in water and steam, contaminating nearby ships or structures, though they generally do not create fallout other than very locally to the explosion. The first atomic weapons test was conducted in New Mexico, USA, on July 16, 1945, during the Manhattan Project, and given the codename Trinity. The test was originally to confirm that the implosion-type nuclear weapon design was feasible and to give an idea of what the actual size and effects of a nuclear explosion would be before they were used in combat against Japan. The early tests were used primarily to discern the military effect of atomic weapons and to test new weapon designs. The Soviet Union also began testing on a limited scale, primarily in Kazakhstan. Neither country had very many atomic weapons to spare at first, and so testing was relatively infrequent. And during the later phases of the Cold War, both countries developed accelerated testing programs, testing many hundreds of bombs over the last half of the 20th century. As weapons technology developed and the size of the blasts increased, one of the major risks was the spread of high levels of radiation for hundreds of miles. And in 1945, this was illustrated by the USA's Castle Bravo test. Scientists underestimated this new form of hydrogen bomb, and the explosion, with a yield of 15 megatons, was over twice what was predicted, and became the USA's worst nuclear accident. And this table shows the total amount of testing that has been done since 1945. And you can see that the USA has been the most prolific in terms of testing, having undertaken more than 1,000 nuclear tests. 6 of those were in the 1940s, 188 in the 1950s, 428 in the 1960s, when the Cold War was really starting to ramp up, 232 in the 1970s, 155 in the 1980s, 21 in the 1990s, and the most recent test that was undertaken was on September the 23rd, 1992. And since that time, the USA has not undertaken any nuclear tests. Russia and the former USSR have undertaken over 700 tests. The first of those was in the 1940s. There were 82 in the 1950s, 232 in the 1960s, 227 in the 1970s, which was a similar number to the USA, 172 in the 1980s, which was actually more than the USA, and only 1 in the 1990s, which was undertaken on October the 24th, 1990. The next highest country in terms of the volume of testing is France, who've conducted more than 200 tests. The first of those was in the 1960s when it undertook 31 tests. It undertook 69 in the 1970s, 92 in the 1980s, and 18 in the 1990s, the most recent of which was on January the 27th, 1996. The United Kingdom and China have both undertaken 45 tests. The UK first developed nuclear weapons in the 1950s when it undertook 21 tests. 5 were done in the 1960s, 5 in the 1970s, 12 in the 1980s, and 2 in the 1990s, with the most recent being on November the 26th, 1991. China did not develop its nuclear weapons technology until the 1960s when it undertook 10 tests. 16 tests were done in the 1970s, 8 in the 1980s, and 11 in the 1990s, with the most recent being on July the 29th, 1996. India developed its nuclear weapons technology in the 1970s when it undertook 1 test. No testing was done in the 1980s, and 2 tests were done in the 1990s, with the most recent being on May the 13th, 1998. Pakistan developed its nuclear technology in the 1990s and undertook 2 tests, the most recent of which was on May the 30th, 1998. And North Korea has been the most recent country to develop its nuclear weapons technology in the noughties, and in that decade it undertook 2 tests and 4 more in the following decade, with the most recent official test taking place on September the 3rd, 2017. Negotiations on a comprehensive ban on the testing of nuclear weapons commenced in 1955 and involved predominantly the USA and the Soviet Union. And after a prolonged period of negotiation, the Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed on the 5th of August 1963. The treaty was initially signed by the USA, the USSR and the UK, who were subsequently joined by another 123 countries, and the intention of the treaty was to ban detonations of nuclear weapons for military and civilian purposes underwater, in the atmosphere and in outer space. However, the Partial Test Ban Treaty had mixed results, and over the course of the following 10 years, 436 additional nuclear tests were conducted. In 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was introduced, which prohibited non-nuclear weapon states, so basically countries that didn't have nuclear weapons by that point, from possessing, manufacturing and acquiring nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. However, at that time, India, Pakistan and Israel all declined to sign the agreement on the grounds that such a treaty was fundamentally discriminatory, as it placed limitations on states that did not have nuclear weapons while making no effort to curb weapon development by the countries that did have them. India, Pakistan and Israel all subsequently developed their own weapons, and nuclear testing continued throughout the 70s and 80s. However, in 1985, the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev announced a unilateral testing moratorium, and in December 1986, Ronald Reagan, who was president of the USA, committed to pursue a long-term goal of a comprehensive test ban. And in November 1987, negotiations for a full test ban restarted. Little progress was made over the next few years. However, the breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War helped accelerate discussions, and on September 10, 1996, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. It was opened for signature in New York on the 24th of September and signed by 71 states, including 5 of the 8 nuclear-capable states at that time. As of September 2023, 178 countries have ratified the treaty, and another 9 countries have signed but not ratified it. And interestingly, the countries that have not ratified the treaty include the USA, China, Egypt, Iran, and Israel. And India, North Korea, and Pakistan have not signed the treaty at all. This chart shows the total number of nuclear warheads for each of the 9 countries, and you can see that Russia has the most, with just under 5,900. The United States is second with around 5,250. China has around 410. France 290. The United Kingdom 225. Pakistan 170. India 164. Israel 90. And North Korea is at the bottom of this list, but officially has 30 nuclear warheads. Now, this graphic shows the location of those nuclear weapons, and they're split into 3 different categories. The first are the red dots, which are operationally deployed. So these are weapons that have been situated strategically in the event of the need for usage. The blue dots represent long-term storage, so these are not weapons that are armed and ready to be used immediately. And the yellow dots relate to either design and production of new weapons or old weapons that are due to be dismantled. So as you can see, both the USA and Russia have a variety of red, blue and yellow dots, as you would imagine. And there are a variety of blue, red and yellow dots in China, Pakistan, India, Korea and Israel. But what's interesting about this graphic is that there are only 2 countries in Europe that officially have their own nuclear weapons, being the UK and France. However, the cluster and the number of red dots around Europe represents the most operationally deployed nuclear weapons anywhere in the world. And the reason for this is the NATO alliance and the fact that US and European weapons are being deployed in a variety of countries with a view to being able to be used to strike against an aggressive nation, predominantly Russia. So unofficially, it's been reported that the US has shorter range nuclear weapons located in Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands and Turkey. This means that if Russia decided to deploy any of its nuclear weapons or threatened to do so, then the US would not have to rely on long-range missile launchers to be able to counter-strike. They basically have nuclear weapons ready and armed and could deploy those within a short space of time in a response to a Russian strike. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video firstly to put you into the picture as to what Russia recently announced about nuclear testing, but secondly to talk about whether or not there is a risk of a new Cold War developing and whether we could go into a second period in the world of worrying about a nuclear war. As you've seen from today's video, Russia has announced that it's decided to revoke its ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And this has been seen by a lot of people as the first step to Russia reigniting its nuclear testing program. And if it does that, there is a very strong possibility that the USA and China could follow suit and we could see more nuclear testing. The last nuclear test that Russia undertook was in 1990. It was actually the USSR, not Russia, that undertook those tests. And if you think about how much technology has moved on over the course of the last 33 years, 33 years ago, very few people had cell phones or PCs. In fact, Google hadn't been created. iPhone didn't release its first phone until 2007. And Tesla didn't release its first car until 2008. So if you think about how much technology that we use on a daily basis has moved on over that period, there has been a massive leap forward. And the massive improvements in technology also apply to weaponry. The USA, Russia and China's weapons today will be far more advanced than they were back in the 1980s when most of the testing was being done. And a recommencement of nuclear testing would represent a huge threat to global peace, because if Russia now has weapons that have longer ranges and more devastating impact, then it may encourage President Putin to start thinking about where he could deploy that weaponry. Now, as I'm sure you'll be aware if you follow the channel, Russia has been struggling financially over the course of the last 12 months. The cost of the war in Ukraine, coupled with the effect of the sanctions, has had a double impact on the economy. it's had a drop in income at the same time as its expenditure has gone up. And as a result of that, the Russian economy posted a deficit of $47 billion for 2022. And so far in 2023, the situation is worse. So it's likely, if Russia continues at its current rate of spending, that the deficit is going to be more than $50 billion for 2023. And at the start of the war, Russia had a national wealth fund of around $150 billion. So that tells us that at the current burn rate, Russia will run out of cash by the end of 2024. So President Putin needs to do something to bring this war to a conclusion. Now, he's already stated that Russia will never retreat. They are not going to pull out of this war. They will fight to the bitter end. And that means that some sort of resolution, some form of peace deal needs to be agreed if this war is going to end. Now, as it stands at the moment, Ukraine, who are supported by the West, are not backing down. They are very unlikely to agree to a deal whereby Russia could keep all of the territory that they're currently occupying. So we've got a real stalemate here and a situation where nobody is likely to back down. Now, President Putin is fully aware of the financial situation that Russia is in. In fact, he's more aware than we are because we're getting very limited data. And if he and his people have been realistic and are looking at the financials and working out how much time they've got left, President Putin may decide that he needs to do something to accelerate the end of this war. And a threat of launching nuclear strikes wherever they be, whether it be in Ukraine or elsewhere in the world, would definitely catch everybody's attention and have everybody focused on bringing a successful conclusion to this war. So the recent announcement that Russia has decided to revoke the testing treaty for nuclear weapons is the first step to raising the bar, reminding everybody that Russia has a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons, and by doing some testing, that would be a very clear signal to everybody that Russia is getting ready to use those weapons. And if that does happen, then this situation could represent the biggest threat to global peace and the biggest risk of a nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis when JFK was president of the USA in the 1960s. Now, hopefully things won't develop to that level, but I think what we're seeing here is a manifestation of the problems in the Russian economy. The financials are now starting to have an impact on the decision-making of what's happening in the war. And this saber-rattling, reminding the world that Russia has a huge arsenal of nuclear weapons that it's not afraid to use, could be a way of President Putin trying to force everybody's hand and agree some form of peace settlement to give Russia an out in this war before it runs out of cash. I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments on this story. Hopefully you found today's episode useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.